Welcome to Interplay Conversations in Music. This is your host, Michael Shapiro. Today, I not only have a guest, but I have a very dear friend, Gerard Schwarz. Hi, Jerry.
Hi, Michael. Nice to see you.
Great to see you. And I have to say that, when you say the words Gerard Schwarz, it's an astonishing situation because you are, apart from being, I shouldn't say apart, because you're a wonderful father and grandfather. I know that from our many conversations. And that's where I start. And the Menschlichkeit of Gerard Schwarz is unparalleled in my book. But I first met you when you were playing trumpet in the American Symphony Orchestra under Stokey through Elie Siegmeister years ago. I think it was Carnegie Hall. And then the New York Philharmonic as a principal trumpet. Then this astonishing career as a conductor, an astonishing career as a composer and arranger, an astonishing career that goes beyond tomorrow with our wonderful Gerard Schwarz, and also your great work with the Milken Archive, which is we'll get to. Jerry, you're also a wonderful writer because you write like you speak, which is very personal and very direct. So I've read your two wonderful new articles in Gramophone magazine about the emigre composers, the ones who fled, the Hitler time, and then the Americans who you championed, like many of my mentors, all of whom I knew personally, especially David Diamond, of whom we've spoken with great affection and characterization over the years. In any event, if we could divide this conversation up as quickly as we can with many people to mention, starting with the Americans and then going to the emigres, if we could. Under the Americans, you talk about the unjustly neglected, and I completely agree with you, American Symphony. There was a time, and Bill Schumann was obviously one of the major voices in that, of establishing an American voice in the symphonic realm, brought on a lot by Koussevitzky and Stokey in the old days, and Reiner and Zell and so forth. So speak to this. What attracted you in being the Koussevitzky of our time, I might say? And
I wish I were the Koussevitzky of our time. What he accomplished with the Boston Symphony for American music was extraordinary. If you think
but what you've accomplished is extraordinary too. There are 300 Gerard Schwarz recordings, many with the Seattle Symphony and with the Liverpool Philharmonic, I believe. Talk about the Great American Symphony and why.
Well, when I was growing up, my parents were medical doctors from Vienna. And when it became obvious that I wanted to be a musician and not a doctor, my father decided, well, I better be as highly educated a musician as possible. And as a youngster, I played the piano, of course, and the trumpet, and I composed. And so he said, well, I'm going to get you a composition teacher. Long story, which I won't go into now. He found Paul Creston for me, and he became my composition teacher from the time I was a freshman in high school.
Amazing.
And then, of course, my emphasis was not in composition or in piano, but on the trumpet. And as a trumpet player, the repertoire you have, aside from orchestral repertoire, solo repertoire, you practice as a kid. Of course, I practiced all the excerpts and all of that, but the solo repertoire is Baroque music or new music. There's not much in between, a few pieces getting there. And so I became very interested in new music. I had a wonderful teacher. My main teacher was Bill Vacchiano, who was the first trumpeter of the New York Philharmonic.
Astonishing player.
But before that, I had a wonderful teacher named Ronald Anderson. And Ronnie was a member of the American Brass Quintet, and he was a champion of new music. And he could play this stuff. It's unbelievable what he could do on the trumpet. And so he was a great influence on me, again, when I was in junior high school into my early high school years. And so I had all these influences. And I really wasn't conscious of how unusual that might be. I wasn't even conscious of how some of these great Americans were not as well thought of or well known or properly represented as others. It was just, this is what I did. And so it became very natural for me.
And you studied with Giuseppe Guto Reggio, otherwise known as
Paul Creston.
And there are people, it's astounding to me, having grown up with the name Paul Creston, who was one of the most performed American composers, no question, of his generation. Every major conductor, I think even Cantelli, I mean, everyone, Reiner, everybody, they all conducted his music. And he was known as a great craftsman and also a very passionate type and an opinionated kind of guy. So talk a little about your personal experiences with him. What did you exactly study with him? And who was Paul Creston as a man?
Well, I'll never forget my first, when I brought in a trumpet concerto I'd written for trumpet and band. And he sat there at the piano, and he went through it. And then when it was over, basically what he said to me is, okay, for next lesson, write 50 melodies. That was how it began. And then it was 100 melodies. And then it was a discussion of harmony. Then it was a discussion of fugue. Then it was a discussion of form. And rhythm was a big deal for him. And yes, he was extremely opinionated. He was certainly not a fan of the serial music that had become in fashion. He wasn't even a fan of Gustav Mahler, who became very much in fashion. Mm-hmm. And yes, his music was played by all of the great conductors at the time. He wasn't like David Diamond was. David Diamond was a warm and fuzzy guy. I mean, he was just hard on the sleeve, wonderful human being. Difficult at times. Don't look at me. Creston was a much more austere kind of person. Not that he wasn't friendly; he was very friendly, but it was very much get the work done. I came into my lessons. It wasn't how are you today, Jerry? You know what's going on in your life. Nothing of that. It was all
How
about.
long were you with Creston? How many years?
3 years.
3 years. Yeah. Well, that's a fundamental training like I got with Siegmeister, which is amazing. It lasts your entire life.
Yeah, and Siegmeister is another composer who wrote some wonderful. I remember recording a brass sextet of his that was just fabulous. And I knew him, of course, and wonderful.
That's how I met you.
Just never played. I mean, okay, Siegmeister may not have been William Schumann or David Diamond, but he certainly wrote wonderful music.
And also Toscanini, Stokowski, Metropolis all performed his music, as well as Commissiona later and Loren Mazel. I mean, it's not like he wasn't getting it out there, and a lot of the other conductors of the time. But again, he's one of that group. And Ellie had the issue of the Red Scare when he was blacklisted, in the 50s. So that was a whole nother ball of wax. You have conducted the Third Symphony. I know that you love that of Creston, the so-called mysterious one, right? Would you talk about that very briefly, please?
Well, when I was writing the article for Gramophone, they, I must say, are brilliant and quite wonderful. And they said, we'd like you to write an article about the forgotten American symphonists, but they didn't want an article where I would name every composer. Ellie Siegmeister, don't just name all. That's not important to us. What's important to us is that you pick 4 or 5 pieces that you think are underrepresented or unknown, and talk about those pieces and those composers. Of course, how can you do that? On the one hand, we got a lot of mail that said, well, what about this one? What about that one? What about Roy Harris?
Always the case.
And of course, naturally. This wasn't a hodgepodge of naming all the composers I could possibly think of, but rather 5 pieces that I thought should be played regularly by major orchestras. Again, even a piece of Alan Hovhaness that I had talked about, Mysterious Mountain, which is played a lot by high school and college groups, is almost never played by professional orchestras. I remember when I did it with the All-Stars, all these members of Boston and Philadelphia, they said, how come we've never heard this piece? And many of them have never even heard Hovhaness. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary.
Crazy. I heard Stokowski do it live. I'll never forget it. And I met Hovhaness backstage with Stokey once. An incredible thing. When I saw Hovhaness coming towards Stokowski, Stokowski stopped. And, the waves parted, and he said, Mr. Hovhaness. Everybody kowtowed. It was really quite a moment. But the Mysterious Mountain, which Reiner recorded and made Alan Hovhaness, very well known at that time, is astonishing. And then you recorded it,
Twice.
which is a great recording. And then you did it again. You did it with Seattle, and then you did it with NBC. I'm saying NBC with your All-Star group.
And the All-Stars.
Yeah. I once had a conversation with William Schumann, which was very interesting. Young composer meeting older composer, and I spoke to him about his symphonies, and he was regretting to me, and Peter Menon also had the same conversation with me later, that they had wonderful first performances, but the second performances, the third performances were out the window. They couldn't get them. Not true of the Schumann Third, which you speak about in your article in Gramophone, but Schumann Third was known for a very long time with Copland's Third and Harris's Third as the great Third American Symphony, the statement. Siegmeister's Third also is astonishing, which he recorded in Oslo. But I'm just curious to know, why were these composers at that time, was it the Shostakovich influence, that they had to say something in a symphony?
Well, symphony was the most important form. It was symphony and string quartet, whether it be Shostakovich or almost anyone else. Now, there were, Puccini was an opera composer. Verdi was an opera composer. It didn't mean that they weren't great composers. Of course, they were great composers. But during this time, the great statements you made were with symphonies and string quartets. And I remember being in our New York apartment with a bunch of composers. David Diamond was there, and Stephen Albert was there, and David was giving Stephen a lecture about how he should write a string quartet, because your craft is really clear in a string quartet. If you don't know how to get from one section to another in a string quartet, you just have to stop and start over again. And that was the disease of many composers of the 80s and 90s. But it is the most important musical form for us. Look at Beethoven, look at Mozart, look at Haydn. String quartets and symphonies. That was the great repertoire. Of course, then it changed by the end of the 20th century. Orchestras weren't so interested in doing big symphonies anymore, and it became ensemble music, right? It was the group for contemporary music. It was a contemporary music ensemble. All those groups that then were writing conducted chamber music, basically.
But the orchestras also have, at least the business people in the orchestras, for a period of time, and even with the 19 that the New York Philharmonic has just commissioned, they want short pieces.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there's no question. The short pieces are the ones that get played. I don't know if I've said it in that article, but if you write a 5-minute piece, a lot of performances, 10, good, 15, 20, you get to beyond 20 and you get one performance. You're making a commitment. If you do the Diamond Second Symphony, which I think is one of the great masterpieces.
That's my next piece to talk about. 20th
century symphonic music. It's 43 minutes. You're making a big commitment. The audience is making a big commitment. And it's for a conductor, it can be dangerous because unless you're at the New York Philharmonic where you're doing 35 weeks of subscription, whatever it is, and you can do that, and you can make a statement, and you can get it accepted. If you're in Boise, Idaho, with the Boise Symphony, and you're doing 6 or 8 performances a year, and then you do the Diamond Second, which represents 10% of the season, someone in the audience is going to write, well, I come to the concerts and 10% of it I didn't like, or something like that. It's very tricky.
It can be tricky, but you know what? It's not true in the wind ensemble world, as you know, at all, where they'll do a 40-minute piece by, Ticelli or any of these wonderful band ensemble.
There's a whole other world because their repertoire is based on 21st century music.
Right.
It's based basically, now it's changed, but it was always American music. You go to a wind ensemble or a band concert, it was all American music and it was all new music, and it still is. And people, but let's go the other side of that. Except for the military bands, name the repertory bands that are playing weekly. Doesn't exist.
No. The only one that's professional really is the Dallas Winds, which I've conducted.
And how often do they play concerts?
I think about 8 times a year.
Yeah, exactly.
But at Meyerson, though, at the big hall.
Well, I understand, but there's a difference between 8 concerts a year and a full season.
You're very right. You're very right. But it's painful to us because, part of it is some of us believe, as an active composer, I believe in many ways that the symphony orchestras are glorified cover bands.
Glorified
cover bands, meaning like, bands that do, Tom Waits or, or Beatles tunes or The Dead, it's not The Dead, it's The Dead cover band. So what is different about the great orchestras not being cover bands, doing the same rep over and over again, because that's what fills these massive halls. It's an interesting thought.
It's also a problematic question because, so let's assume now, look at the band, all right? The wind ensemble of the band. They don't have Beethoven, they don't have Haydn. No, they have so a wind. They have an octet, but they don't have real major works by major composers of the 18th and 19th century. Occasional piece, okay. The symphony orchestra, on the other hand, has lots of Haydn, lots of Mozart, lots of Schumann and Schubert and Mendelssohn and Beethoven, and the list goes on. And those pieces need to be played. And it's important that they get played. But it's also important that you play new music of the new generation, like you, Michael, play your music. But then it's also important to play music from the 1950s and the 60s. You see the problem.
But now you've touched on it. I come from all of the composers you mentioned. They're all my mentors. And I add Vincent Persichetti, my teacher, and Malcolm Arnold, my teacher, as well as Siegmeister. Those three were my teachers. My time with David Diamond was instrumental in my life. Very close to him as humans, as people, friends, It was for a long time, 30-odd years. And in these days, my dear friend John Criliano, Phil Glass, there are people that I really admire and I love to be with. And I wonder as we go forward, when I was a kid, we were kids, Menon was still alive. Schumann was still alive. The music was being done. And then, boom, it came down. Sam Adler was recently on a program that I was on, and he was talking about that he had, after all the music he's written, some really great stuff, he's very worried that the only thing that's going to be remembered of Samuel Adler, he's now in his 90s, are his technical books of instruction.
Orchestration book.
Yeah, his orchestration book, like Piston's Counterpoint book, or Piston's Harmony book. And you talk about Walter Piston in your article. Major composer, major teacher. I want to switch to the Europeans if we can, because your other gramophone article is about the emigres.
It isn't out yet, but it'll be out soon.
Okay, well, I read it, so we can talk a little. Thank you for sending it to me, but we can talk about some of those emigres. When I was the music consultant to the Holocaust Museum, when it first opened up in D.C., we did concerts, obviously, of the Terezin composers, so forth, but we did also concerts of the emigres. Korngold, Ernst Toch, Castelnuovo Tedesco, Berlinski. You go through the list, Goldschmidt, so forth. There were many who had to flee the Hitler Zeit, which we talked about at the beginning. And then there is Bohuslav Martinu, who to me is astonishing for what he accomplished. In the article that will come out, you talk about his, I think, Third Symphony, am I right? Why that particular piece, Jerry?
I could have picked the fourth. Those are my two favorites. But I like them all. I mean, Martinu is an interesting character because if you ask most musicians, was Martinu an American citizen, they would all say no. But Martinu became an American citizen. Martinu wrote his 6 great symphonies here, mostly in New York, Connecticut, and most of them were premiered in the United States. Koussevitzky was a big champion of Martinu's music. And Martinu was, if you go to Prague, his music is played quite often. I'm sure in London, if Bela Lavek or someone like that, of course, would be playing his music because they had composed, Martinu had conductors who championed his work. But the reality is that, I don't know when any of our major orchestras have last played a Martinu symphony. Those symphonies are terrific, but also they're not long. They're not 45 minutes. What happened? And of course, what I say in the article is that he wrote so much music that it's hard to say, oh God, I want to play a piece of Martinu, a piece of chamber music, and you see 100 pieces. Which one should I choose? But where the symphonies are concerned, Mohian wrote 6. It's not so difficult, and they're all good. I mean, if I were music to the New York Philharmonic, I would do one a year, every year.
Astonishing pieces.
And people would get to know his voice, and it would be quite remarkable. And they're only 25 minutes, 25 minutes long. You're not committing, 80% of the program to those pieces. He, as you know, was a close friend of David Diamond. I'm not sure if they'll use it in the article, but I have a couple of miniature scores here where Martin wrote a very beautiful salutation to David Diamond.
Oh, I have to see that. David, I think, subrented his apartment near the Plaza Hotel.
Yeah, he did. And,
you can't make this stuff up.
Well, what was interesting about that, of course, from David's point of view, is that Martineau was a success, right? He was a successful composer. And he would spend the summers in Connecticut or some other place, and then David would be allowed to live in his apartment. I don't think he actually paid any rent, but he lived there. And I remember, as I mentioned in the article, when I was conducting the Third Symphony of Martineau at the Czech Philharmonic a few years ago, they asked me to also do the Fourth Symphony of David Diamond, because they were written the same year, and they suspected, and they were probably right, that they were written in the same apartment. And here we have this great American who wrote one of his great symphonies, the Fourth, and Martineau, one of the great Czech American, who wrote the Third Symphony the same time. I mean, it's really marvelous to see great music, but also a little sad to realize that without conductors who have a platform and who are willing to champion those great composers, they will not be known.
There is one aspect, though, which you should be very proud of. I've noticed with my own career quotes as a composer that the thing that is most important to me is performances are wonderful, but they're over quickly, right? Recordings are forever, at least as long as there is a forever. And your over 300 recordings are astonishing for what you've put down. When you mentioned Koussevitzky, you've recorded David Diamond's Second Symphony, and it's a fabulous recording. Only recently, somebody uploaded the radio broadcast of the premiere by Koussevitzky of the David Diamond Second Symphony. And that's had, I don't know, on YouTube, 167 views or something. Well, your recording is out there, big time, on Naxos, heard by thousands of people, and also put on the radio. The fact that it's hardened into a recording has to be tremendously satisfying to you. Because despite the fact that, the New York Philharmonic is not doing David's Second Symphony next year, or my Second Symphony next year, there are recordings of both.
Well, I mean, the great thing about that is when you talk to a conductor, let's say, and say, you should think about doing the Diamond Third Symphony, which is also a wonderful symphony, and not as long, right? It's 25 minutes. Yes, they could get a perusal score, which isn't so simple to get. You think publishers would be better about it, but they're not.
They're not.
But they can go on Spotify or on YouTube and listen to it and say, oh, I'm interested. Now, the key there is to listen to, how can I say, a good performance. If you don't have a good performance, I remember when Horacio Gutierrez, a wonderful pianist, great pianist, was asked by Bill Schumann to do his piano concerto. And Horacio came to me and said, Jerry, Bill has asked me to do this. Can we do it? And I said, sure. We did it in Vancouver. We did it in Seattle. We did it in New York. And I said, Horacio wants to do it. I have a great respect for him. Sure. There was a recording out at the time, which I listened to then. And had I listened to that before I said yes, I would have said no. Mm-hmm. Because the recording did not represent the piece as I believe it should be represented. And it didn't make a case for it. When Horacio did it, boy, he made a case for it. And
astonishing
it was fantastic.
Pianist.
So sometimes, I'm not saying that my recordings are all great. Let's leave that alone. But sometimes if the recording isn't good, it can actually hurt the life of a piece. There are those pieces that need help, but need to be interpreted. You do the Beethoven Fifth.
It's the truth of Beethoven too.
When I was in high school, I played, there was a New York mandolin orchestra, and they'd play a yearly concert at Town Hall. And they would hire wind players, for $5 or whatever. So contacted me, and I came, played first trumpet and this mandolin performance of the Beethoven Fifth. You know, it was good. It represented the Beethoven, sounded like the Beethoven Fifth. I mean, it was weird, but it worked because that piece, with its history and everybody knowing it, you know, mediocre performance, a performance by mandolins, a performance with a band, doesn't really matter. Yet your Second Symphony, if it doesn't get a passionate, committed performance, you know, it's a harder sell.
But I have a recording which I did with the City of Birmingham Symphony, and that's forever.
You happen to be a good conductor.
Well, it helps.
Thank goodness.
It helps. The only reason I went into conducting, really, apart from doing standard rep and loving it, was to record this music. You know, it's very helpful.
That's reason. That's why you should.
Boulez did the same thing. There's no reason he wanted to conduct Beethoven. He did the standard rep because he wanted to earn a living so he could write. I know that from him personally.
Wasn't his thing.
He kind of didn't enjoy it that much. He had a limited repertoire, and he was.
I'm not sure he enjoyed it, but he didn't do it very well.
Okay. In any event, the thing is, Jerry, I want to talk about the last thing, and then we have to flee this half-hour wonderful talk with you, which is always fun. You have worked a lot with the Milken Archive of Jewish American music. I'm on there, not of a solo cello piece, but you recorded, for example, the Berlinski wonderful piece, Avodat Shabbat, with, I think it was the Rundfunk Symphony Orchestra Berlin. You also recorded the Ernst Toch wonderful piece with the Prague Philharmonic Chorus, Czech Philharmonic, and Theodor Bakel, of all people, being the narrator. And that was the Ernst Toch's cantata of the Bitter Herbs.
Mm-hmm.
What I love about the Milken Archive was that it hired people like you to go about the world recreating this amazing music that might have been lost otherwise. The Berlinski is one example. He was 89 years old in a wonderful documentary, which can be watched on YouTube from the Milken Archive, of coming to Berlin, this German composer who had to flee.
German-American composer, Michael.
Well, so I was going to say he had to flee to American, kind of like the Schwarz family. It's very similar. And here he goes, and he's with you, and he talks in the most wonderful words about Gerard Schwarz. To me, full of Menschlichkeit, you know, great conductor, recreating this music in a way that is thrilling. And that as those two recordings are priceless. I really believe in bringing the music of Ernst Toch and, Herman Berlinski to the fore. And then to even make it even more wonderful, you recorded a piece by my teacher Suzanne Bloch's father, Ernst Bloch, who was a Swiss-American composer, called America, which talks about 1620, 1861, and then the future, 1926. These three incredible movements of Ernst Bloch in his piece, America. No one's doing this piece, but my God, it's amazing, isn't it?
Well, you picked, of course, three of my favorites. It's like, I know we're short of time now, but quickly, Berlinski was actually close to me in a bizarre way. His son was married to Julian's second major cello teacher, Toby Sachs. I mean, they divorced, but
oh wow!
And he wrote a piece for organ and trumpets for the opening of Temple Sinai in Seattle. I'm having him with us in Berlin, talking the pieces in Hebrew and English. Mm-hmm. And of course, his first language is German. He's from Leipzig, talking to this very young chorus and telling them what it means. And to see these kids, I mean, they were 20s, on the edge of their chair, listening to every word of what Herman was saying. It was among the more touching experiences that I've ever had. Toch was another one of the really great composers. His symphonies are fantastic. I mean, he is really extraordinary. And this cantata for the Bitter Herbs is among the most, I remember when I did it in Prague, a friend of mine from Vienna who was working for Universal Publishing came, And I really was curious because we did a nice program. We did the Mio Sacred Service, I think, on that program also.
Also a fabulous piece.
Another piece. And so I said, so what do you think? Oh, no, didn't like to talk. I said, oh, really? Why? I said, well, it sounds like Richard Strauss. It does. It doesn't bother me. I love Richard Strauss, one of my favorites. And Ernest Bloch is among the most interesting of them all because he was such a giant in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. His Shlomo for cello and orchestra is very well known and often played. Little else. America, I used to think wasn't liked because it used American folk music, folk tunes. And, you can use Austrian folk music or German folk or French, you're fine. Use American, Yankee, Doodle, Hell, Columbia, really? Do you really want to do that in a symphony? But, when I've re-listened to that piece recently, before I wrote the article, I was struck by how powerful it is and how wonderful it is. And what a great, my favorite story, and be the last thing that I know the time, is that the piece has a chorale at the end that he wanted to be an anthem. He wanted to be the next Star Spangled Banner. Oh, okay, that's maybe a little far-fetched, but anyway, it wasn't. I was doing 3 concerts of it in Seattle, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And his idea was you should have the audience sing this anthem. So Sunday was a talk concert where I talked to the audience called Musically Speaking. And so we talked about Bloch. We talked about the piece. I put the music of this anthem in the programs. I go, people don't read music anymore. It's my big argument about program notes. I think they need musical examples. If you say the first theme, write it out for us, would you?
Yep.
Anyway, so they give, and I explained to them what's going on. And I said the piece takes 45 minutes and you'll hear this theme over and over again and it'll be in your ear. And then members of our Seattle Symphony Chorus are going to be standing all around you and they'll help. And then I'm going to turn around. I'm going to ask you all to stand up, and then I'm going to cue you, and then let's see what happens. 3,000 people were there. They sang. Did everybody sing? I don't know.
It's fabulous.
But, wow, what a sound. It was extraordinary.
I want to talk about
story is Monday and Tuesday, I was not a talk concert. I didn't speak to the audience. I inserted the music with a description of what was going to happen.
Bloch.
They all stood. They all sang. It was, it was one of the miracles of life that worked.
Final miracle I want to talk to you about in 3 paragraphs or less.
Hard for me.
You're an expert on this, like nobody else that I can ever talk to about this. Why does certain music of certain composers last and others are buried in history? Why?
Well, of course, I'm supposed to say it's impossible to say, and I've got to wait 100 years, and it's not true. It has to do with, is it memorable? Does it have a memorable theme? Does it have a memorable harmony? Does it have something that the audience can take away, even after one performance? Now, it doesn't mean they have to know it exactly, but I remember as a youngster, people would talk about Schoenberg and say, and I'm a great Schoenberg lover. Talk about Schoenberg and say, the people just don't understand it yet. Well, how many audience lovers, like the 5 pieces? I love it. You probably do too, Michael. But an audience...
Actually, not.
Not. Okay. An audience will not... There's very little to take... I can take away from it. Even if not your favorite piece, you can take stuff away from it. The Farben, you can take a lot of things away. An audience, they don't get it. And they never will. And is it because they're sophisticated? No. Is it because they're not educated? No. It's because in its essence, it's not memorable. Memorable music with melody, harmony, rhythm, structure, but especially melody and harmony. If you're lacking that, it's hard. Now, it can be affect. It can be the talk piece that he did just with words, the
geographical piece.
Right. Yeah. So there's no melody, there's no harmony, there's only rhythm and words, but it's amusing. And is it a masterpiece? No. Is it a great work of art? No. Is it entertaining? Yes.
Hugely.
Now, what we try to do in the world of music, we're not entertainers. We are artists, and we're trying to create music on a high artistic level. And it doesn't mean you can't write entertaining music. And it doesn't mean that it's not wonderful music. But on the highest level, where the composers are trying to write things of significance, we can have an hour-long discussion about that word. But that's, I mean,
Volume
that's
two.
What do you think, Michael? Do you concur
It
with
needs to get under their skin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if it doesn't get,
helps that a lot too.
Say again?
Hearing more than once.
Of course, but it needs to get in under their skin. Arthur Honegger talked about, and this is your life, about the presentation of new music should be dynamic and astonishing. And I will end this by saying that Gerard Schwarz is, for me and for so many people, a blessing and a treasure of American and world music. It's amazing, Jerry, what you've done and continue to do wherever you go.
Well, Michael, it's so sweet of you. And I can also concur that you are a great composer and deserve all the fame that you're getting now.
Well, we're working on it, but and
I look forward to your new opera, which sounds incredible.
Thank you. Well, I do too. It's like anything else. I'll show up when they premiere it. So, Jerry, again, you've been my guest on Interplay. Gerard Schwarz, thank you so much for your wisdom, your guidance, and your love for everything you do and all the people that come and meet you. It's astonishing. Again, I use that word, what you've accomplished and what you do on a daily basis. Thank you.
Great being with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Gerard Schwarz. This is Michael Shapiro for Interplay Conversations in Music.